Today, we want to explore this question. Is the Sustainable Development Goals Initiative an appropriate framework for sustainable global development? The post-2015 SDGs are highly significant because they set out a quite comprehensive agenda for global development. The acclaimed objectives of the SDGs are to reduce poverty and inequality. The initiative has been presented and endorsed as a comprehensive framework that responds to all of the most important global and local development challenges of the 21st century. A central value of the SDGs, expressed also in the preamble of the UN resolution that underpins them, is to leave no one behind. But should we really consider the SDGs to be an appropriate framework for reducing poverty and inequality? The pursuit of development goals and objectives, which often seem uncontroversial, has frequently produced unforeseen, unintended, or unacknowledged problems, conflicts, and consequences. An important question, not least from the perspective of understanding the political implications of the initiative, is therefore, is it possible or plausible that the SDG initiative could sustain and reproduce inequalities? To address this, I introduce and critically examine what I will show to be some very problematic assumptions about development and poverty that underpin the SDGs in their current form. And after this critical examination, we will be able to better appreciate the role politics may play in perpetuating inequality. All this will help us understand why, although they may appear to be uncontroversial at first glance, the SDGs have already been subject to critical political analysis. We will then also be able to appreciate why some individuals and social groups may not want to be part of this project and may really want to pursue development outside of the SDG framework. Let's begin with the basics. What are the SDGs? They comprise 17 goals and a total of 169 targets associated with these. A range of different indicators serve as the measure to monitoring progress towards achieving these goals. An important question is this: what are some of the goals and how are they to be realized? An example: of the 17 goals, SDG 1 focuses on poverty more generally, SDG 2 on hunger, SDG 3 on health services, SDG 4 on education, and SDG 14 on water. It is significant to note that except for SDG 4, which makes a commitment to free primary and secondary education, there is no explicit reference to a policy of redistribution that would guarantee, for instance, entitlements to food, water, or health services. That is, in the SDG framework, there is no provision for a universal guarantee to entitlements to life-sustaining needs and the requirements beyond these for living dignified lives. Rather, the framework construes the realization of most of these goals as conditional upon the implementation of a few targets of one specific goal, namely Goal 17. Although this goal has several public-private partnership targets around access to communication and IT, for example, the preeminence of trade liberalization and commercialization is its most consequential aspect. The United Nations resolution clearly acknowledges the significance of Goal 17 for the SDG framework. It does so specifically and in detail in a section themed Means of Implementation. What exactly is the political significance of SDG 17? SDG 17 relates significantly to the implementation of free trade rules, including obligations to work by the rules of and entrench the regime of the World Trade Organization. The upshot of committing to SDG 17 as the means of realizing most of the other SDGs is that this effectively mandates, for example, establishing markets for water, health services, and even educational services. Commercialization, therefore, becomes fundamental and a cornerstone value of the SDG framework. A potential consequence with broad and far-reaching implications is that those who cannot afford to pay risk being denied entitlements to life-sustaining needs. Let us return to the two questions raised in the beginning. Is the Sustainable Development Goals Initiative an appropriate framework for sustainable global development? Is it possible or plausible that the SDG initiative could sustain and reproduce inequalities? Our response to the first question depends crucially on how we understand the causes of poverty and inequality. If we assume that inequality of access to water, health services, and education, for example, occurs because of their insufficient integration into markets for services, then the SDG framework would seem appropriate given the emphasis of SDG 17. On the other hand, if we think that the causes of poverty and inequality are not merely due to a lack of markets, but significantly because of commercialization, we may well arrive at a different response. For example, if we can demonstrate that some people are deprived of fundamental entitlements to needs that sustain healthy and dignified lives because they are poor, then poverty must become the focus of our inquiry. If we were to explain poverty merely in terms of insufficient commercialization, we would quite simply disregard a vast body of knowledge accumulated about the politics of inequality and development. For example, it was labor struggles for justice and equity that resulted in the welfare state in the post-1945 era, which entailed a commitment to redistribution more generally. We must also not forget that global structural inequalities, a legacy of colonialism, meant that many post-colonial nations were from the outset severely constrained in realizing their commitments to their citizens. In the 1970s, these states put forward a call through the United Nations for a new international economic order. The aspirations and struggles for the new international economic order were motivated by commitments to ensure welfare and justice for all. The core bloc of capitalist countries at that time did not support the call for a new international economic order. The politics of the SDGs can hence be discerned from the explicit normative premises which underwrite fundamental goals. These reflect a commitment to neoliberal premises about inequality, poverty, and development. For critical scholars, as well as activists struggling for more just relations of development, the SDG framework, and especially its emphasis on Goal 17, which spells out the means of implementation, can actually serve to reproduce inequality, poverty, and conflict in and over development. We can arrive at this critical conclusion through a careful and close analysis of the SDG framework, together with an understanding that poverty and inequality are not originating on natural conditions, but are constituted through relations of power, domination, and social struggles. Development is not and has never been apolitical. Competing explanations of poverty and inequality are aligned with different political approaches to development. A critical understanding of poverty and inequality will alert us to the fact that creating markets for water, for example, resulted in many poor families and communities being denied safe drinking water. As a consequence, many people may fall ill, as has been the case with outbreaks of cholera in South Africa, brought on by people's last resort of using contaminated river water. It is very important to be clear here. We are not arguing that markets are problematic per se. Rather, the point is to indict the kinds of markets that aim at commercializing public goods and services in the name of reducing poverty and inequality. The SDG framework has economic growth and modernization through neoliberalism at the center of its agenda, and this is highly problematic. What then can we make of the SDG commitment to leave no one behind? The SDG commitment to leave no one behind is part of the political discourse of inclusion. However, for many, there are good reasons to contest any efforts at incorporating them into this agenda. It is through critical analysis of the kind I have outlined that we can better understand the politics of organizing and contesting relations of development and inequality. We should now have a better understanding of why the SDGs as an approach to development are contested and challenged, especially by those who care deeply about social suffering and ecological sustainability.